I'm a space cowboy. I'm sure you know where it's at. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hey everybody, this is Dan Deppman for cardrunners.com, and today I'm going to be bringing you two tables of full ring PLO 8. Originally, I planned for my first few videos on Card Runners to be an advanced classroom series, because I'd gotten some feedback from the people who had watched the stock series that they wanted something like that. But then after I released the first one, I got a lot of feedback from people on Card Runners saying they just wanted a general overview on how to play and they wanted to see more hands end to end. So I'm going to be showing some full ring, well, not live play, but in the replayer here, and I'll cover starting hand values and some other things for the people who aren't as familiar with PLO 8. But then I'll also get into some more advanced concepts for the other people who have seen the previous videos. So this hand on the right here, I got a very strong starting hand, although we're out of the small blind. Generally speaking, I'm going to be playing very, very few small blinds, especially in full ring. However, in this case, the guy who raised the Riparian, I'm not sure exactly how he says his name, he's a very strong, aggressive player. He's playing 35-24, which a lot of times when you see someone playing like that in full ring, it generally means that they're a fish and they're just probably lag tarding a little too much and don't really know what they're doing. But this guy's definitely an exception, and so he's going to be very difficult to play with from out of position. Although in this case we do have a really strong hand, and his range is going to be super, super wide, so with a hand like this we're going to be way, way ahead of his range, and he's also going to be very aggressive from position, so the times that we do flop good, he's going to c-bet a lot, he's going to attack us a lot on the turn, and we'll be able to get a lot of value out of him the times we do flop good. However, this time we really don't. We flop top pair, top kicker, and a bad 3-5 low draw. So out of position against an aggressive player, this is going to be really tough to play. One of the things you always want to think about on the flop is what kind of turn cards do I want to see, and basically if there are a lot of turn cards you're going to be happy with, they're going to allow you to put a lot of money in the pot, or set you up to bluff, then you can get a lot friskier on the flop. In this case, there's not really a whole lot that we want to see flop. Even if a deuce or a four comes, it doesn't give us the nut low. Two pair is sketchy, since a lot of our, 5 and a 3, a lot of our two pair hands either put a flush possible or make some other kind of good hand possible. And so this is really just sort of we started off with a good hand, but this is really a check fold kind of situation here. And usually he's going to be c-betting a high percentage of the time here. Over here on the left, this is double suited, but pretty junky hand overall. Not really all that nutty. It can look pretty to some degree, but it's just not a hand that can ever make the nuts. So when we have double suited hands like this with low rank, their value is going to go up quite a bit if we can get the pot heads up. Obviously multi-way, your lower flush draws are going to be good a whole lot less, just being an Omaha game with everybody having 4 cards. And the problem is this guy raises. We don't really know much about him yet. He just sat down. If we flat call his raise and play from position, that's okay, but that's really going to encourage the blinds to play. And you've got this guy here, Steeler J, and the big blind, he's playing 60% of hands. So if we call behind, he's calling at least probably half the time. And then you've also got this short stack here that if wakes up with a good hand, he can jam on us, in which case we would have to fold. So I really don't like flat calling here too much from the button. And 3-betting to isolate is not really a good idea because our hand is pretty weak. When we're 3-betting to isolate in general, we either want to do it with a strong hand where we're doing that for value, or sometimes against the player who's just really, really fishy, or not even fishy, but or fishy in the sense that if this player was overly tight, or he was going to just try to flop the nuts or fold, well then you could 3-bet a lot. in those situations, knowing that your c-bets are going to take the pot down a large percentage of the time. But in this case, we don't have any information about this guy to know that that's the case, so the best thing is to give it up. Although it may seem on the surface gross to fold a double-suited hand like that on the button to just a single raise. And then over here he's c-bet, and we just folded. So this hand on the button, this is a really garbagey hand. Although when it is folded to us on the button, we're going to want to be playing a whole bunch of buttons. This one, I believe I went ahead and raised this just because this is a video, so more often than not I've tried to go ahead and play the hand if it was even remotely marginal. This isn't really that marginal. In general, I should just be folding this hand, but I decided to go ahead and raise to attack the blinds. When it is folded to us on the button, we are going to want to be raising a pretty large percentage of our hands. Although, one of the other considerations, especially in full ring, where you've got 6 players folded in front of us, in general, though, when it is folded to us on the button, our range is going to be tighter to open the button than it is in 6 max. The reason being, all these guys folded and presumably they didn't have good hands, so that means the deck is going to be pretty rich in aces. 6 people folded in front of us, so that means 24 of the cards folded out. Just about, half the deck is accounted for, so that means that the deck is going to be really rich in aces and wheel cards, and so the probability of the blinds waking up with a good hand when it's folded to us on the button is much higher in full ring than it is in 6 max. And so even though we're going to play looser than normal, obviously, from the button, we're not going to want to play as loose as we will in 6 max. And so I like to go ahead and raise here, and yeah, and he 3-bets, and so at this point, and this is part of why this open is kind of bad from the button, just because there's no way we can call a 3-bet. There's not really any good flop for us other than somehow flopping a straight, and given, like I said, given all these folds, the probability that he has a hand like ace-ace, which has us just crushed, really goes through the roof. We don't really know anything about this player. We've only got a couple hands on him, but that's likely a very, very strong hand. Not many players also in PLO 8 are going to be 3-bet bluffing from the blinds when facing a button steal. Some strong aggressive players will certainly do that, but in general you're not going to see that nearly as often as you are in tougher hold'em or PLO games. So given all those factors, his range is really, really strong, and our hand is just not that good. So we have to give up at that point. So, sort of reasonable high hand. This hand looks better than what it is. If we had the ace suited, this would be much more playable. But as it is, it's just not a great hand. There aren't many flops that fit our hands. We've got 3 diamonds, and without the suited ace, we're just not going to make the nuts often enough. So over here, we've got a hand that would be looking great if this was PLO high. For PLO 8, not that great overall. The high wrap hands are just not going to fit a lot of flops. So in general, the kind of flops you want to have with hands like this are ones with 4 high cards. And generally speaking, if no cards are eliminated from the deck, the flop is going to be 3 high cards about a third of the time. And if we've got 4 high cards in our hand, then we're only going to get favorable flops about 25% of the time. In this case, we've got 3 high cards since the 8 actually counts as a low. But so what I'm trying to say is, though, in general, we're not going to hit too many flops with this hand. So we want to play these kinds of hands in situations where our implied odds are really, really good. And generally that means multi-way pots where you're going to have a lot of people in there. So if I'm going to play this from late position, I like it when we've already had a bunch of limpers or something come in where I can just limp behind and see a flop cheap in a situation where we're going to be maybe 4 or 5 handed. So that way you've got a decent pot size to start with, and the times where you do flop good, there's a good enough chance that someone's got a second best hand that's going to come along with you. In position with everybody folded, it's just kind of tough because we're not really going to get a multi-way pot often enough. And we've also got the short stack to our left, and so if we open and he 3-bets, we really can't call that because our implied odds are just going to be really, really bad. And the other thing is we've only got one suit. If we had double suited, I'd be a little bit more inclined to open it up, but generally this is the kind of hand you want to be careful with. If this was a 4-card run to a king, it would be those same considerations would still hold, but it would be a much stronger hand. But this 4-card run to a jack with a single suit is just something you really want to be careful with. So I go ahead and open it, and we'll kind of see what happens here. If he comes in and plays, this is actually kind of a good situation because the flops that hit us on this with this kind of hand are going to be boards that don't hit. They're going to be fairly dry boards with a bunch of high cards, and so in general that's not going to hit. The boards that hit that particular hand are boards that don't hit most of our range, and so aggressive players like him are going to tend to really attack us a lot more on those boards, and so between that and having position, we can get quite a bit of value. And one of the other things I don't like about 4-ring is it can get slow at times. Although one of the advantages because of that, you can play a lot more tables than normal. But for the sake of this video, I wanted to leave it at 2 tables just so I can kind of focus in a little bit more. So over here, I got 2 aces. Pause this. So you can see I'm raising to 7. So in PLO 8, 2 aces, even with bad side cards, which we basically got bad side cards here, the jack and the 8, you're very rarely a dog to any other hands other than other aces hands with better side cards. You've always got pretty good equity. So this is a hand that's pretty strong, although in general, if we get a lot of action, since our low potential is pretty bad, it's something you're going to want to be careful with, but it's definitely strong enough that we're going to be raising for value here. And we really want to try to knock out these players behind us and get position, which doesn't quite work out. So, oh, I remember this hand. So we flop top 2 on a really, really dry board, and so this is a good situation for us. And this was a hand that I completely butchered. I think, I don't know what happened. I don't know if I just misclicked or wasn't paying attention or what, but I actually check fold this hand here, which is pretty awful. I should be betting for sure. So I end up folding to the pot size bet, and that's pretty bad on such a dry board. I mean, the only thing I'm really in any kind of trouble against is a set of 3s. If the guy's got a bare low draw, I want to bet to give him a chance to draw a bad lead. There's just not much to be afraid of on this board, and so like I said, I don't know what happened here, but that's definitely not the way to play it. So over here on the left, I've got another high rundown hand where I call a raise, and I do this. There's a bunch of players behind me, and I'm really hoping that some more players call behind, and we can get into a multi-way situation. So we do get 3-handed, but I basically missed this flop. This is a really wet flop with the 2 low cards and the ace and the flush draw, which we don't have, and so like I was mentioning before, we're not going to hit many flops with these kinds of hands. And this is one where we definitely missed. Although the advantage of those kinds of hands is that when you do hit it, it's usually somewhat disguised. And so I turn a wrap draw, but now there's a low possible and a flush, and in a multi-way pot, there's just not much sense in getting too crazy there. So the other thing to note too is when players are sitting out. So here we've got 2 players out, so we're actually 7-handed here. So this is going to play a lot closer to our more normal 6-max games. And so in general, we'd be able to open a wider range here than we normally would, even though if the table was full, we'd be in relatively early position. In general, the kind of stats you want to have in full ring is, like I said, pretty tight. Playing styles in this game vary really widely. You have some people playing real tight that are winning players, and then other players like the Riparian here playing a super lag style that do it effectively. In general, playing around 20 VPI P10 raise. In this session, I looked at the stats. I was playing about 21-12, which is a little bit looser than normal. You can actually, optimal play is probably a little bit tighter than that, but like I said, for the sake of the video, I want to try to play when I'm in marginal spots. I'll tend to play more often than not, since I was making this for a video. So this hand's pretty strong, not suited to the ace, which hurts quite a bit. So in early position here, we got a limper in front. So if we raise, he's at least going to call, and we're probably going to induce at least one more caller as well. So the hand is very strong, not super nutty. We don't have ace deuce, we don't have a suited ace, and so raising in early position doesn't really accomplish much. We're just bloating a pot early on in a case where we have a strong hand, but not necessarily a great one where we just want to jam for value. So most of the time I'm going to just limp behind here. Occasionally, if you do want to raise this, I'd recommend just a min raise to encourage more people to come in, and kind of sets up your implied odds for when you do flop the nut low or make a wheel or something like that. These are the kind of hands that play really well heads up, because what you end up doing is making a marginal high and a marginal low, kind of like we flopped here. So if we were heads up here, we could put a lot of pressure on one player. When we're multi-way, obviously we're not just gonna nut pedal and not play unless we make the nuts, but obviously we're gonna have to flop a lot stronger than if we were in a heads up pot. So if we were playing 6-max or we are in later position, this is the kind of hand I'll ISO or sometimes even 3-bet to try to get heads up. But being early position in a full ring game, that's just not really going to be too possible, so we like just to limp. So we hit a pretty good flop, top 2, and we've got our non-nut low draw. So in a 5-way pot, it's really hard to put a lot of pressure on people, so I don't know that we really want to inflate a pot too much unless we think we can get it to heads up. So this guy comes out and bets, and there's 2 players behind. So when these 2 guys check, obviously it makes it a little less likely they've got something unless they flop the set or something like that, and we're hoping to check raise for value. We've got top 2, so the probability of a set of aces or a set of queens goes way down. So I'm really not too worried about these players after they check. This guy behind us has a short stack, so if we raise this guy and this guy comes along, really not too worried about him, because we've got the kind of hand where it's hard for somebody to scoop us. Where this hand is difficult is when you're multi-way. So I end up raising here to try to ISO this guy and knock them out, and I make a smaller re-raise. I think most players in these games, especially at these smaller stakes, when you re-raise like that, they're not so much looking at the size of your re-raise, but the fact that you re-raised. So I don't think people interpret it as, well, someone opened in front of this guy and he raised small. I think they just look at it as he raised. So I think you get pretty similar credit for raising small as you do for raising big, and you limit your downside risk a little bit. So if one of these guys was slow playing like a flop set of aces or something, hoping to check raise, and then they're going to jam, this gives us the option to get away from the hand a little bit cheaper if that happens, and then if we decide to lay it down. But you're also sending the signal that, hey, we have a lot of strength, and they should probably fold. But like I said, our goal here is to get heads up against Heath, because this is the kind of hand, especially if any kind of low card comes on the turn, we're going to be in really good shape to put a lot of heat on this guy. And he ends up folding, and that's really surprising. Not too often are people going to bet into 4 other players and then just fold to a small re-raise, so I'm kind of curious as to what he actually had to do that with. I wouldn't expect him to do that too often. I would expect him to re-raise sets and then just flat call with his other holdings and go from there. But if he had just flat called, we would have been in great position to put a lot of pressure on him, like I said, especially if a low card comes on the turn. So over here out of the blind, we've got a really garbagey hand, and even if like all these players call, we're not going to be wanting to play this. If you're going to play out of position multi-way, you really want to have some potential to make the nuts. And even if we flop a set of 5s here, that's definitely not going to be the nuts. Similar situation over here with this hand. Like I said, we're going to play super, super tight out of the blinds. And hands like this, which if we were heads up with our double suits, being double suited has a little more value being heads up. But out of position, especially against definitely one aggressive player, and then this guy plays quite a bit of hands as well. We're just never going to know when we're good or not. So over here we got a pretty decent high hand, no suits, which hurts it a little bit. So again, this is one where we're really not going to hit a lot of flops, but when we do, it's going to be somewhat disguised. So this guy has a super wide opening range, and so we're well ahead of his range. But with 100 big blind stacks, I don't really want to re-raise out of the blind, because he's going to also call us pretty wide, and since we're not going to hit many flops, that's going to be pretty difficult to play out of position. So we really don't want to 3-bet and cut down the stack to pot ratio, because we're not going to flop good that often. That's going to create a really unfavorable situation for us. So here I'm going to want to just flat call, and then at times where we do hit a flop, our hand's going to be fairly disguised, and he's probably going to be very aggressive, and that'll work to our advantage the times that we flop good. So we want to leave our implied odds as good as possible here. And this flop is just horrific for our hand. So you've got low possible, straight draws and straights, and flush draw possible. So on a super wet board like that, there's really no point in trying to bluff, because he's going to call with most any piece of it with the intention of taking it away on the turn when we either show weakness or when he gets good turn cards. Kings do have some decent strength in PLO 8 sometimes, but not nearly as much. Definitely not as much as Hold'em, obviously, and not nearly as much even as in PLO. So they're the kind of hands that are very, whether you play them or not and how aggressively you play them is very dependent on the situation. And out of position on a bad flop against an aggressive opponent is just not a time to get too out of line. So here's another good, it's the kind of hand that's good to play heads up in position. So we're going to raise to try to knock him out. If this player comes in, it really complicates things quite a bit. Played, everybody folds. Another strong hand we're definitely going to raise from later position in the hijack. Thing to note though is we don't have a lot of great high potential. So we're not going to make the nuts in both directions very often, but we do have position and we do have a bunch of wheel cards, and so it'll enable us to put quite a lot of heat on players that play with us out of position. But everybody folds again, which makes that not as interesting as it could be. So hopefully some more interesting spots come up here before too long. This is a hand that is really dog poop. Even on the button, this is you can just never quite make the nuts with a hand like this. Even when we make straights with our little 3-card with a gap thing we have going on here, there's going to be lows possible. Queen high flushes are not that good, so even though we're on the button, there's not much we can do with that. And it's amazing how sometimes people will overvalue hands like that. Actually, when I was playing the WSOP event back in June, I saw one of the best No Limit Hold'em live tournament players in the world, well, and online players, open Queen 6-7-8 from under the gun, which is not a good thing to do. So over here, big double pairs is obviously going to be pretty strong. We're going to play that from the button. If he were to jam on us, we wouldn't be folding. It's funny, he's been playing the short stack, but I haven't seen him. He seems to be playing pretty tight. So here, there's a pretty decent flop for us. The board is paired. There is a low draw. But in general, double paired boards obviously are going to be good ones to bet since they're pretty hard for people to hit. It gives him an opportunity to call if he wants to get stubborn with just a bare low draw. Calling here, if you're in his shoes, just with like an ace deuce or something like that, without any kind of real high, it would be a pretty bad call. So if we bet here, we're given the opportunity to make a mistake. And the other thing too is even if he does get stubborn and call, we're going to be able to bet him off a lot of turn cards. So this turn card, not really the greatest for us since it brings in the low, obviously, and some straights. Decided to go ahead and slow down and check behind, since if you look at the things he could be calling the flop with, he's calling with overpairs, like he could have overpair of aces, obviously not kings or queens since we've got the other ones. He's not going to show up with jacks or tens too often if he's at all a decent player, since he did color raise pre-flop. So he'll have like aces, fours, or low draws, like good low draws like ace deuces, things like that. So basically we're behind all of those hands at this point, and so I slowed down on the turn. If the turn had been like an 8 or really any kind of high card, I definitely would have been barreling the turn. And so he bets out full pot, and that's pretty tough. And that looks like kind of like an ace deuce that wants to fold us off the high half, or possibly a 4 that he slow played. So I go ahead and give it up. You hate to call a full pot size bet on the river when you're hoping to get half. And he's the kind of guy too that's not, he's playing 1.2 aggression factor. He's not super aggressive. Here's another good hand that, well, it's a good hand we're definitely going to play. You want to be a little careful and just realize that you don't have great high potential. So a hand like ace deuce 4-4 is going to play much better in multi-way pots. So we're just going to flat call here. There's no value really in 3-betting to try to get position, since we don't really want to be heads up. We want to encourage the whole world to call, so that times where we make the nut low, we can win half of a large pot. But as it is, we end up heads up, and we actually get a pretty good flop here. So we've got the second nut low, and a pair and a bad flush draw, which if this was a multi-way pot, this would be a pretty sketchy flop. This is one where we would have to be really careful on, but heads up is a much different situation, since it's really difficult for somebody to have a hand, for one player to have a hand that can scoop us. So just go ahead and blast away. So this gets even better for us. So now with the second nut low and bad flush draw, even though in a multi-way pot this would be one where, like I said, depending on the situation, if this is 3 or 4 handed, you might end up folding this on the turn. But against one player, if you look at what he needs to have to scoop us, he's got to have ace 3, and then he's got to have 2 bigger spades. So there's certainly times where he's going to show up with the ace 3 of spades, or some other combo of hand that scoops us. Compared to his overall range, especially when he's playing 39% of hands, there just aren't that many hands in his range that scoop us. And by playing aggressively, we can get him to fold out half the pot a lot of the time. So sometimes he's going to show up with bad flushes that beat our 4 high flush, and other, possibly other ace-4 low type hands. And so I think you're going to show more profit playing aggressively and getting him to fold out those other hands. But he does come out and swing for full pot, so I like to just flat call there. The thing is, generally when someone pots a turn like that, if you jam over top of them, they're never folding. With these kinds of hands, what we really want is fold equity. So at this point, though, we're not folding, so we just get it in with them. But the advantage of just flatting the turn there is it gives us the chance to full pot if he does check on the river and possibly get him to fold out half. As played, he didn't do that. He did end up with the nut low, which, heads up, not many players are gonna fold that, even though he has the possibility of getting quartered sometimes. But I think because he was blocking the nut flush, he played that a lot more aggressively than he otherwise would have. If his ace of spades would have been the ace of clubs or something like that, he may have slowed down a little bit and given us the chance to put more heat on him. So the hand with 3 wheel cards, but again out of position. Not much we can do there. So I'm interested to see what he has on this hand. So 4-4-3, when he pots into 3 other players, he's usually got something. And then his bet size on the turn looks like value. So we don't get to see what he had, but it's probably something pretty strong. Another hand that can be somewhat decent if you're playing PLO high, but one that's really, really bad for PLO 8. Basically, middle cards are bad, particularly 9s. And let me just pause this here. Oh, never mind. Really, really bad in PLO 8. So even if it had been min raised to us, we'd probably just be folding this. So we flop a flush, but it's kind of a bad one. We got whatever that is, like about the 4th nut flush, and there's a low draw. So playing against 4 other players, there's really not a whole lot we can do from out of position. So now we've got a really bad low, and we still have our flush drawn. I'm just going to go ahead and check again. Especially when I checked around on the flop, you're going to get called by 10 and jack high flushes quite a bit of the time. I'm really just hoping to get this hand to showdown. At this point, though, I could definitely consider a bet there, because usually once it checks around a couple times, people are going to start to value bet weaker flushes. Yeah, so I may have missed a little bit of value there. If I had made a small bet on the end, I may have... Oh, I definitely would have... Well, I would have gotten him the call, but I would have been chopping. Versus him, he had the nut low. I'm actually really surprised that he checked the nut low on the river there after it had checked through on the turn. Something you should keep in mind against him. I probably should have taken a note on that. Because even though he was obviously probably worried about getting quartered, when the pot is 4 or 5 handed, getting quartered is usually not as big a deal when your head's up. Another pretty hand, which we're just hoping this limps around. We really don't want to play any kind of sizable pot out of position with it, because King Jack 4-5, even though we're double suited, is just not going to be nutty enough. If we call behind here, he's going to call, which he does anyways, and we're just going to be in a really, really awkward spot. Unless we happen to get the ace-2-3 flop or something like that, which isn't going to happen very often. I don't know what the probability is, but it's pretty darn small. Over here, a bunch more middle cards. Again, another one that can look tempting if you're familiar with PLO, but it just doesn't play well at all here. His min raise is a little suspicious, especially when he's only raising 2% of his hands. he seems to be looking for calls. So against somebody like that, his range is going to be pretty darn strong. That's weird that he folded. That was kind of a strange hand. I would expect his range there to be pretty aces rich, since he's only raising 2% of hands. That's basically all the aces hands. I think you can either get ace, ace, XX about 2.5% of the time, or whatever it is, and that's a flop that's pretty good for aces. So over here, this is a great hand to have heads up. It's one of those where you're going to make marginal hands both directions most of the time, which is going to make it really difficult for a single player to scoop you. Another note here too on bet sizes from the button. Generally when it's folded to me on the button, I'll raise 3x instead of 3.5x, just because it usually accomplishes the same thing when people are in the blinds. They're either going to play with you or they're not. So I think you save the half a bet. And it also allows you to open a little wider range from the button. So the times where you open garbage and you get 3-bet where you can't call, you're losing a little bit less. You're not committing quite as much. And that also encourages people to call a little bit more, which is not a bad thing, because when you have good hands, you're going to get more value out of them and you're still going to have position. So, not the greatest flop in the world for us as far as hitting our hand, but it is somewhat dry. There is a flush draw and 2 cards to a straight, but no low. So this is a pretty good flop to c-bet most of the time. Now if he check raises or something like that, we're going to be giving it up. But this isn't going to hit most of his range. Most of the time when we're deciding whether or not to c-bet, the main criteria is going to be board texture. You know, the super wet boards like that one we had earlier, I think it was the 5-6-8 two-tone. You can pretty much always count on getting called on those boards. But those boards where there's only one low card, you're going to get a lot more folds. And even when they do call you or play back at you, it really defines the range a lot more. So in a board like 10-9-5, two-tone, you know, they're going to play at you with top 2 pair sets, flush draws. That's about it. It's actually a fairly narrow range when you consider all the hands that they could have, and so it makes it easier to play against them on future streets. So over here, ace-ace-4 with a suit, definitely going to be playing, and in some cases trying to ISO and like to play this heads up. Although you're pretty much always an equity favorite most all the time with aces. They really don't play well multi-way, so there's definitely a lot of value in trying to get these heads up when you can. So flopping the set, we're really going to try to get him to fold out a bad low. So this hand in general, let me go back to that real quick. Yep, I backed up a little too far, sorry about that. So this hand is pretty strong overall. We got the suited ace, we got the ace-4, and then some other kind of middle cards. From position, this is going to play really well, but being up front with a million players to act behind, we're really not going to be too happy with it. If the table is really passive, which this one's fairly passive overall. We have position on the one aggressive player. We could consider limping and try to create a limp fest and either flop a flush draw or the deuce 3 or something like that. But in general, the times where it's going to just limp around and you're going to hit a good flop are going to be pretty small, so there's really not too much you can do with this hand from up front. So I like to fold it. Although a lot of times in a 6-max game, that'll be a different story depending on your position, or in a 4-ring game when we're in later position. I think a lot of players will see the suited ace-4 there and just throw money in, but full ring, you got to be so much stingier from up front than in 6-max. It's really the kind of game where hand values, just understanding hand values and position are more important than fancy play. And then I go ahead and play this one. We got another suited ace and the ace-3-4. It's actually kind of similar to that other hand which I just folded, other than I've got ace-3-4 instead of ace-3-7. I think there's a big difference between having 2 wheel cards and having 3 wheel cards, just because the counterfeit protection is really key in this game. So if we do flop a deuce and end up making a nut low or a nut low draw, it's a lot more valuable if you got a counterfeit protection card than if you don't. Although still, this would be one that would not be the worst thing in the world to fold from up front like that. So we flop our nut low draw with our counterfeit protection, which is good. So here we're kind of benefited from the fact that we're in a 3-way pot. We don't really have any credible high potential unless the 5 comes in, which would give us a wheel. But that's not going to happen too often. So I'd really kind of just like to see what happens on the turn and then maybe go from there. So now when everyone checks through, a lot of times when people have the nut low, they'll tend to bet. Most of the time, there are players like our friend over here who is very timid with the nut low. But generally, when we've got the nut low and then it checks around on the flop, it's a lot less likely that we're going to be getting quartered. And so now we want to go ahead and start throwing some money in the pot. So as far as bet sizing on this, the argument for betting more, like betting a 3/4 pot or a full pot, would be to try to fold out some bad flushes and scoop the whole pot right now. The other strategy to consider is to bet small and try to encourage both players to call so you get more value when you're getting half the pot. As it is, I make a larger bet here. The other thing you could expect is a lot of people to be betting flush draws. And really the intention of that bet is to try to take the pot down. If Johnny calls behind as well, our odds of getting quartered obviously go way up. So here I'm going to throw some heat on us. If he raises us, it's pretty gross. But we do have 2 pair and the nut low, and so it's tough for him to quarter us in that case. He's got to have 3/4 and then a flush, or a flush plus or a nut low plus set or some other bigger hand, which one player is just not going to have that often. And the other thing too, he's been playing this hand relatively passively so far, which doesn't really suggest a monster. So we're trying to get him to fold out half the pot, which ends up working. Under the gun, playing very few hands obviously from under the gun. So I'm going to play a few more hands here and then wrap this up pretty soon. I'm not sure what hands are coming up here. Hopefully we get 1 or 2 more interesting ones before we wind this down. So I may actually turn this into a two-part video. I taped about an hour of play for this, and I'm not that far into it because I had so many pauses where I was trying to talk, so I may just continue on here and make a part 2 to this. So, and also please leave me feedback on these. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of the stocks members who watched the other videos, what they were looking for is quite a bit different from what the people who had not watched the stocks videos were looking for. So please leave me feedback. You can send me PMs or post in the forums to let me know what you like and what you don't like. So I'm trying to figure out the tastes and preferences of all the members. They seem to vary widely, and I'm trying to make everyone as happy as I can. But again, the more feedback you give me, the better I'll be able to do that. So we'll wrap it up with this hand. Obviously really, really strong. One of the few hands that I'm going to be raising out of the blinds. And I just completely whiff this flop. Top pair, top kicker is not too good on this. Now that I make trips, it's not as likely that he's going to have an ace. I can put a little more heat on him. I make a smaller bet size. I'm trying to make it look more for value. Although in reality, I really want him to fold. So at this point, there's not a whole lot I can beat if he wants to put money in the pot, and I give that up. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. This was Dan Deppen for cardrunners.com.